what is driving mass incarceration and what we need to do to end it. And an incredible book that came out roughly 4 years ago, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. And it really, it spent at this point more than 75 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's invigorated, more importantly, a discussion that was needed to be had in this country. So before I turn it over and begin talking with Michelle and then take some of your questions, I wanted to go over a few things about housekeeping. Number one, as you know, everybody is muted, and that's because of the high volume and the high response we got to this call. It was just, human nature just means a few people are going to be on the call. If we didn't do it this way, unmuted, and it would be disruptive, so we've had to do it that way. We do want your questions, though, and at roughly the 30-minute mark, we'll be taking them. In that time, what I would ask is that you please mail the conversation at drugpolicy.org. That is the conversation, one word, at drugpolicy.org. Your name and your one-line question, so that we can include it and pose it to Michelle. Just to, again, go over sort of the plan of the call, I'll be talking with Michelle. We'll be hearing from her for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for your questions. And so with that, I'm going to open by, sharing with you unplanned. I'm in Mississippi. My colleagues around the nation in New York and California, in places far and wide, are joining us. And I wanted to share, something that felt very deeply spiritual to me, which is that although I didn't plan it, this call is being held in the offices that were once Medgar Evers. And we're actually in a room that he could never have used when he was alive because he was such a target, and there were too many windows in this room, and so this room was actually closed off when he was alive because of risk of him being shot. And it seems deeply apropos that as we get on the phone with Michelle Alexander to talk about the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the age of color blindness, that we do it from the office of a man who did so much to try to create a colorblind world, or at least a world where people were not being discriminated because of the color of their skin. And so, that said, we wanted to talk with Michelle because I don't know that even she could have even imagined the impact her book would have, with, as I said, over 75 weeks on the Times bestseller list, and how from the White House to houses of worship, there are really few places where one can go where there's not a discussion about what it means that the United States, with 5% of the world's population, also has 25% of the world's incarcerated population, and that the single greatest policy cause for that terrible statistic has been the failed drug war. Most or all of us who are on this call have watched this dialogue develop from our particular seats at the table, whether we're advocates, whether we're formerly incarcerated, whether we're just concerned citizens or journalists, politicians or political scientists. But this afternoon we wanted to talk with Michelle because she's had a very particular and unique seat at this table, and we want to know about what she has witnessed and learned from that particular and unique seat. So although you can't say it out loud, I know you were joining me in welcoming Michelle Alexander.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this dialogue. I think the idea of having a series of open dialogues on these pressing issues is a great way to extend the conversation. And so I just really appreciate being invited and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to go ahead, because we do only have this short time together, to launch right in and begin with thinking about in the new Jim Crow, you consider the role of the black middle class and sort of more mainstream civil rights organization in helping to end mass incarceration and the drug war policies that drive it. So I wonder how you have seen the landscape change in the last 4 years, if indeed your opinion is that it has changed.
I think it absolutely has changed in profound ways. When I was in the process of writing this book, I was feeling incredibly frustrated. by the failure of many civil rights organizations and leaders to make the war on drugs a critical priority in their organizations. I was frustrated by many of my progressive friends and allies to have an awakening. The failure of so many people that I knew and cared about to have kind of an awakening to the magnitude of the harm caused by the drug war and mass incarceration in our communities. And yet at the same time, I had real empathy because, as I acknowledge in the introduction to the book, there was a time not so long ago that I didn't get it. I failed to really understand the horror of the drug war in poor communities of color, and I failed to connect the dots between mass incarceration and slavery and Jim Crow and understand the ways in which these systems of racial and social control are being born and born again in this country. And so in writing the book, I felt this fierce urgency and some frustration. But, over the last few years, I just could not be more pleased with the reception that the book has received. Many people warned me that civil rights organizations might be defensive or even angered by some of the criticism in the book. But, the contrary, the NAACP, the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the list goes on, did nothing but respond with enthusiasm and some real self-reflection. And I have seen now, over the last 4 years as I've been traveling from state to state, speaking in prisons and universities, in churches, at conferences, speaking to judges, speaking to all kinds of different audiences, that there absolutely is an awakening taking place. But, I think it's so important to underscore that this awakening certainly did not begin with my book or my work. Angela Davis coined the term prison industrial complex long before I had even begun to wake up to the reality of the new Jim Crow. Mumia Abdul-Jamal was writing from prison about mass incarceration and our racialized prison state and its links to earlier systems of racial and social control before I had begun to connect the dots. There are many, many advocates, some of whom may be on the call today, who have been doing this work and connecting the dots far longer than I have. And in fact, one of the motivations for writing the book was that I wanted to try to lend more credibility and support to the work that so many people had been doing for so long and that had been marginalized and not taken seriously. So I, am optimistic at this point in time, but at the same time I see that there are, real reasons for concern. There are important victories in Colorado and Washington. It was legalizing marijuana. We see that, Attorney General Holder is speaking out against felon disenfranchisement laws and mandatory minimum sentencing. You see politicians across the political spectrum now, raising concerns for the first time in 40 years about the size of our prison state. And yet, I worry that so much of the dialogue today is still driven by fiscal concerns rather than out of genuine concern for the people and communities who have been most impacted and, the families who have been destroyed, over the last few decades that we haven't yet really had as a nation the kind of conversation that we must have and the kinds of fights and debates that we must have if we're going to do more than tinker with this machine and ultimately break our nation's habit of creating these caste-like systems in America.
Well, and what a beautiful, wide-ranging, and yet succinct answer to that first question, and it makes me think about the initiative that Obama pushed out last week, my brother's keeper. And because, he talked a lot in that about where black boys are falling behind on every piece of the social ladder. A lot of this, I would think, is driven by having disrupted families that are disrupted by the drug war, communities that are disrupted by the drug war, their mothers now gone, and what have you. And it looked, when it came to much of what Obama was saying was that while he made a nod towards structural racism and policies that dismember communities, the real underpinning of what he was saying was that it was a moral failing on the part of those very communities and children. And so I wonder what, and that's probably the way that he's approached race, and this is probably the third big time he's addressed it. Let's say we did it with, on the campaign trail with Gates, with Trayvon Martin, so it's the fourth time he's addressed race, the least of any president, I think, in modern times. And, I wonder what you think advocates might be doing. And let's go to the spectrum of advocates, journalists, writers, lawyers, everybody might be doing to really put some teeth behind that at least opening that we have there. And certainly the more powerful openings we have with the statements that Holder made before the ABA last August about the drug war specifically and mandatory minimums.
Well, of course, I'm glad that President Obama is shining a spotlight on the real crisis facing black communities today, in particular, black boys and young black men. And, he's right to draw attention to it and, lift it up in the way that it seems that he's committed to doing so. But I am worried that much of the initiative is, more based in rhetoric than in meaningful commitment to address the structures and institutions that have created the conditions in these communities. As far as I can tell, in taking a look at the initiative, it seems that there is a commitment to creating some kind of task force to study the problem and identify the kinds of programs that have managed to work in keeping kids in school and out of jail, etc. And there's, aspect of the initiative that seeks to engage foundations and corporations in funding of programs that work. But, from what I can tell, there's nothing in the initiative that offers any policy change from the government or any government funding of any kind to support programs that are desperately needed in these communities. And, there's almost sort of an implicit assumption that, we just need to go out and find what works to help people lift them up from their boots by their bootstraps and survive and thrive in the current era without acknowledging that, today we're waging a war on these very communities that we claim to be so desperately concerned about. And there is much that President Obama and Attorney General Holder and Congress can do today to alleviate so much of the suffering that is being experienced in these communities. I think that the initiative itself reflects kind of this common narrative, one that I admittedly embraced at an earlier point in my own life. This narrative that suggests that the reason why there are so many, poor people of color, particularly black men and boys, trapped at the bottom, cycling in and out of jails, is because of bad schools, poverty, and broken homes. And that if we just address those problems in those communities by encouraging people to get married and stay married and encouraging young people to stay in school and talking to young black men and trying to persuade them to stay out of jail, then this whole problem of mass incarceration and failing schools will no longer be of any real concern. And yet what I have come to believe so strongly, and what helped motivate me in writing the book, was that in so many ways we've got it precisely backwards. That these communities are poor and have failing schools and have broken homes, not because of their personal failings, but because we've declared war on them. We've spent billions of dollars building prisons and allowed schools to fail. We've decimated entire communities by shuttling young people from their underfunded schools to these brand new high-tech prisons. We've begun targeting, children in these communities at young ages, often before they're old enough to vote, stopping, frisking, searching them, ultimately catching them. The first arrest is typically for some nonviolent, relatively minor, drug offense, the very sort of crime that occurs with roughly equal frequency in middle-class white neighborhoods and on college campuses but goes largely ignored. The type of crime that President Obama himself committed in his youth. We arrest these kids at young ages, saddle them with criminal records, throw them in cages, and then release them into a parallel social universe in which, the very civil and human rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement no longer apply to them for the rest of their life. They can be discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits, and they're locked into a permanent second-class status for life. And we've done this in precisely the communities that were most in need of our support, most in need of economic investment, most in need of investment in the schools. And rather than providing, any meaningful support to these communities and these families who, are living in cities where factories have closed down and jobs have moved overseas and who are struggling to make the rough transition from an industrial-based economy to global economy where work has vanished from urban centers, rather than supporting these communities, we've declared war on them and then stood back and said, what is wrong with them? Why can't they hold their families together? Why can't they stay in school? What is wrong with them? When I think, the more pressing question is, what is wrong with us? Why have we continued to blame them for our refusal to treat the real problems of drug addiction and drug abuse with more care, compassion, and concern, and to invest in these communities rather than...
And in fact, do what we've done when other communities have been in struggle, right? This is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did with the New Deal, right? This is exactly what he did, and he came in and undergirded. People still benefiting from some of the programs that he started then, and yet when you see communities that have been completely upended by the original Jim Crow laws, by the original exclusion from institutions of higher learning and jobs, there's nobody who's going to come in and say we need a New Deal to, with this group. And I think that, part of the problem that we're talking about is that if there's going to be any saving, it's only going to be in the private sector. It's never going to be a social commitment at the highest levels of government. And it makes me wonder, I don't know if you saw, Michelle, in Monday's Times, thinking about what we do next, there was an article highlighting the sort of tenuous relationship between Eric Holder and Kentucky Tea Party Senator Rand Paul and how they're standing together now to end mandatory minimums. They're on the opposite sides of the aisle, and there's many who would say that this isn't just an unlikely alliance, but even perhaps an unholy alliance. But I wonder if you would share your thoughts on what you know about their work together and sort of if it is these alliances that some would see as unlikely and even unholy, that is in any way what's needed to address the consequences of failed drug war policies.
I think we have to just be very clear that so much of the progress that is currently being made on drug policy and incarceration generally reflects the fact that we're at a particular moment in our history, a time when politicians across the political spectrum are highly motivated to downsize prisons because we can no longer afford to maintain this massive prison state without raising taxes on the predominantly white, middle class. At the time when I was writing the book, I thought that the book was coming out at the worst possible moment. Obama was on the campaign trail and seemed poised to win the presidency. And I knew that many people would be incredulous at the notion that we as a nation had managed to recreate a racial caste system when we had just elected our nation's first black president. But, now in retrospect, it seems clear that, my book came out in many respects at the perfect moment. It was at the moment when politicians were, for the first time in 40 years, really willing to have a serious conversation about prison downsizing and the insanity of our drug war. But I'm deeply concerned about us as a nation doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Because ultimately, at least from my perspective, this movement to end mass incarceration and this movement to end the drug war is about breaking our nation's habit of creating caste-like systems in America. It's about developing a new ethic of care and concern for each and every human being, whether you're struggling with addiction or at risk of abuse or addiction, or whether you've made a mistake that's landed you behind bars or not. This idea that each and every one of us, each human being, has basic human rights and ought to be treated with dignity, care, compassion, and concern. That is, for me, the ultimate goal of this movement, the real issue that lies at the core of every caste system that has ever been created, every unnecessary war that has ever been declared, is a devaluing of human beings. And if we're going to downsize prisons and change marijuana laws and all that in order to save some cash, but in that process and in that debate and in that advocacy to change these laws, we haven't woken up to the magnitude of the harm that we have done if we have not been willing to, really have kind of a searching conversation about how we got to this place, how we were able to, lock up millions of people, permanently lock out of mainstream society tens of millions of people, destroy families, destroy futures. If we're not going to have a real conversation about that and ultimately learn to care for them, the others, those ghetto dwellers who we demonized in this rush to declare war, we're going to find ourselves years from now either still having a slightly downsized system of mass incarceration that continues to hum along very well, or we will have managed to downsize our prisons, but some new system of racial and social control will have emerged again because we have not yet learned, the core lesson that our racial history has been trying to teach us. And so I do view, these kind of temporary, fleeting, convenient political alliances between, politicians who may have no real interest for, or concern for communities of color or poor communities generally, as real problematic. And I hope that in our advocacy, we will stay very focused on ensuring that we do the right thing for the right reasons and not count as victories, battles won where the real lessons have not been learned.
That was so eloquently put, and one of the many things that I was struck by in that in that statement, and a series of statements, Michelle, was the underlying belief that every life has value and must be afforded human rights accordingly. And I want to make a little bit of a turn here then in thinking about solutions, that there may be no country who has done that for its citizens, at least with regard to this issue, better than Portugal, who made the decision more than a decade ago to decriminalize all drugs. And so let me make for our listeners a clear distinction between decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization removes criminal penalties for drug use while maintaining the right to prosecute the production and selling of drugs. No country on the planet has yet attempted to legalize all drugs, but with Portugal's decriminalization of all drugs, including those considered the most addictive and deleterious to the human body, we've seen drug use remain flat in that nation as the prison population spirals ever downward. We've seen overdose morbidity cut by at least a third, and HIV infection rates caused by sharing dirty needles and crack pipes cut by 2/3, a whopping 2/3 drop in HIV infection simply by not having people share crack pipes or clean needles. And I wonder what we might learn from Portugal in taking a public health approach, because drug use is located there within the public ministry, and the health ministry rather, to drug use, because it holds at its center compassion and the fundamental rejection of the stigma associated with drug use and drug users. Is there something to learn from Portugal, and is there something to import to we living here in America?
Absolutely. I think Portugal is, an excellent example of how it is possible to reduce rates of drug addiction and drug abuse and even drug-related crime in a non-punitive manner, without simply filling, our prisons and jails with people suspected of using substances that we think are harmful. Supposedly the reason we criminalize certain substances is because we're so concerned about the harm that these substances cause people. But then we wind up inflicting on these very same people that we're supposedly so concerned about far more pain and suffering than the substances themselves would be likely to cause. And so, I think we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing really when we criminalize drugs? We're not criminalizing substance. We wind up criminalizing people who use or possess these drugs. And I wholeheartly support a wholesale shift to a public health model for dealing with drug addiction and drug abuse. I think we have to ask ourselves, how would we treat people who are abusing or addicted to drugs or at risk of doing so, harmful drugs? How would we treat them if we really cared about them? Would we put them in a cage and saddle them with a criminal record that would authorize legal discrimination against them for the rest of their lives? Would we lock them up for decades behind bars, robbing children of their parents, making it impossible for young people to have any hope of reintegrating into society? Is that how we treat people we actually care about? I think not. And so I support the decriminalization of all drugs, for personal use. I think that if you're caught with a substance, if you're possessing a substance that is harmful to you, we ought to try to help you, get you the education or the support that you may need. We need to intervene in a way that is supportive and helpful to you, not one that demonizes, shames, and punishes you for the rest of your life. And so, I'm thrilled by the fact that Colorado and Washington has legalized marijuana, that Washington, D.C. has now decriminalized, small amounts of marijuana, simple possession. I think these are critically important steps to shifting from a purely punitive approach to a more caring concern. But again, I think that there's there's some warning flags that are flying in the air right now in Colorado and Washington in particular. And what I see as warning signs is that when you flick on the news, or at least when I do, and I flick on the television and I see images of people using marijuana, and images of people who are now, trying to run legitimate marijuana businesses, they're almost all white. And so, it seems that we suddenly have a positive attitude about marijuana when the images of people who are using marijuana are white, but when we thought of them as being black or brown, then we had a purely punitive approach. And we see also in the media, predominantly white. In fact, in the news that I've seen, it's been exclusively white men who have been interviewed as wanting to start successful, marijuana businesses, and they're hoping to make a lot of money, selling marijuana in Colorado and Washington. And, I have to say to myself, in many ways, the imagery doesn't sit right. Here are white men poised to run big marijuana businesses, dreaming of cashing in big money, big businesses selling weed. After 40 years of impoverished black kids getting prison time selling weed and their families and futures destroyed, now white men are planning to get rich doing precisely the same thing. And so that's why I think we have to be willing, as we're talking about legalization, to also start talking about reparations for the war on drugs. About how do we repair the harm caused. At the end of apartheid in South Africa, there was an understanding that there could be no healing, no progress, no reconciliation without truth and reconciliation. You can't just destroy a people and then say, it's over, we're stopping now. You have to be willing to deal with the truth, deal with the history openly and honestly. And, Colin Powell famously said, if you break it, you own it, meaning if you declare war on a country and destroy that country based on a mistake, then you've got to own that mistake and repair the damage done. But, here in this country, we haven't learned these basic lessons from our racial history. After centuries of enslaving Africans, a war was waged and slaves were set free with nothing. Nothing. No 40 acres and a mule, nothing. Most found themselves essentially re-enslaved through convict leasing or sharecropping. And after a brief period of reconstruction, a new caste system was imposed, Jim Crow. And then another extraordinary movement arose that brought the old Jim Crow to its knees, and America said again, okay, we'll stop now. We'll take down the whites-only signs, we'll stop doing that. But there were no reparations. Not for slavery, not for Jim Crow, scarcely any acknowledgement of the harm done, except for Martin Luther King Day, one day out of the year. And I feel like here we go again. After waging a brutal war, a literal all-out war on poor communities of color, a drug war that has decimated families, spread despair and hopelessness, destroyed entire communities, and a war that's fanned the flames of the very violence it was supposedly intended to address and control. After pouring billions of dollars into prisons and allowing schools to fail, we're going to simply say, we're done now? We're not going to lock people up for those silly marijuana crimes now? That's done? Let's move on, and white men can make money? I say no. I say, this time we've got to get it right. This time we have to tell the truth, the whole truth about how we got to this place. We're going to have to demand some reparations, and by that I mean repair of the harm done. And so it's not enough just to stop. We're going to have to stand up and say, we're human beings who deserve respect and basic human rights. Enormous harm has been done, and it's time not just to stop the harm, but to repair and begin the process of healing and rebuilding these communities that have been decimated over the past 40 years.
I wish, sort of Ellen-like, I could tweet out a picture of the faces of the proud people who serve the Mississippi NAACP State Conference on that last sentence, that last dissertation. Really, we couldn't agree with you more. There's a couple of more questions I would love to ask, but I'll close with this and then open it up to the questions that are being submitted by our listeners, and maybe we'll just capsule this part and I'll go right to the questions from the folks who are listening in, to ask you, after doing The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness, which I neglected to say earlier, was published by the incredible and important New Press, just stalwart in our community. What might you next be looking to undertake? And then I will turn to questions from our listeners.
Well, after a few years of nearly nonstop travel, speaking to anyone who will listen, I've decided to get off the road, and I would like to get back to doing some writing again. And so that's really where my focus is going to be, I think, for the next at least year or so, is trying to do more writing and more reflection. I've learned a tremendous amount from so many of the people that I've met around the country over the last few years and have been engaged in really, phenomenal conversations and dialogues about where we go from here and what does it really mean to build a truly transformational movement. And so that's what I'd like to focus on. I have a number of, projects and partnerships and collaborations that, will continue and that are, emerging. I've been working with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is a national network of, several thousand progressive black faith leaders, and they are committed to consciousness raising and movement building within the faith community. I've been working with Michael McBride and PICO, another faith network that has agreed to, or is really committed to, I would say, ending mass incarceration to its work around violence prevention. They see the necessity of ending mass incarceration in the United States if we're going to have any hope of ending violence and ending the cycle of despair in so many, poor communities across America. And, I think the faith community has such an important role to play. And I am, also working with and in constant dialogue with many people who are formerly incarcerated and leading wonderful organizations. I think, of all of the developments that have occurred over the past several years, what makes me most hopeful is the, emergence of these organizations led by and, powered by formerly incarcerated people and their families, like All of Us or None and A New Way of Life, and a brand new organization that's, being launched by Glenn Martin, Just Leadership USA, which aims to give voice to formerly incarcerated people and train them as advocates and leaders in the movement. And so, I want to continue working with them as well as young people. I've been inspired by the Dream Defenders and, on college campuses across this country, I see more and more chapters forming of Students Against Mass Incarceration and students organizing against mass incarceration in private prisons and doing work in their communities. I'm talking with filmmakers about the possibility of making a film based on the book. I'm working with a really wonderful advocate named Chris Moore-Backman, who is helping to create study guides with Vincent Harding and the Veterans of Hope Project based on the book, both for faith communities as well as organizers and advocates who are interested in taking action and organizing their own communities. Chris Moore-Backman has also created a radio documentary series called Bringing Down the New Jim Crow, which is really wonderful, and I encourage people to make use of these resources. And last but not least, there's a number of school networks, high school networks, and teachers who have reached out to me, interested in creating curriculum for youth, high school students, and young people, and mentoring programs based around the book, so that these dialogues can occur among young people who want to join the movement to end mass incarceration and also want to better understand what is happening in their own communities and their own families and the cycle of incarceration that exists there. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, as part of their Teaching Tolerance program, is rolling out high school curriculum, and we're working with many others as well who are interested in creating similar kinds of opportunities for young people to.
So you're not slowing down is the bottom line.
Yeah.
You may be getting off the road, but you're moving mountains because you certainly do not sound as though you were slowing down, and we are the luckier for it, Michelle. Let me ask that we turn to a couple of questions from folks who are listening, beginning with Washington State. Marcos Zuninga, please forgive me if I am misstating the name, asks, what's your opinion of groups like SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, and its leaders, Kevin Sabet and Patrick J. Kennedy are? Do you have an opinion on that organization and their leaders?
On SAM?
On SAM, S-A-M, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which is sort of, for those who don't know, they're sort of compassionate, but they very much, sort of embrace the addict model, but it's all coercion. It doesn't take it out of the criminal justice system. It's fairly a, disconcerting model.
Well, actually, I have not been in dialogue with the leaders or organizers of FAM in particular, and obviously I am not.
They would embrace coercive treatment and what have you.
Yeah, well, I guess what I want to say is that I'm not interested really here, at least, in criticizing any particular organization or approach, especially one that I'm not, intimately familiar with, but what I think is so important now is that we shift to a public health approach to dealing with drugs, and that the attempts to keep to finding ways of ensnaring people in the criminal justice system, I think are ultimately counterproductive. And I know that there's an argument that there needs to be some kind of hammer, some kind of threat, in order to persuade people to, stay away from drugs, and that it sends the wrong message if, harmful substances are not criminalized. And, as a parent of, children, 3 children who I hope will not become drug abusers or drug addicted, and who, I want to make very wise choices about everything from tobacco and alcohol to other substances, I can understand the concern. But at the same time, I have to say that, I am much, much more concerned about my children being criminalized and thrown into a cage and dehumanized and saddled with a criminal record for the rest of their lives, than I am with them experimenting with illegal drugs. I experimented with illegal drugs. President Obama experimented with illegal drugs. Most people who use illegal drugs do not become drug addicts, and I think we really need to move away from a punitive approach of dealing with these substances to away from approaches that ensnare people in the criminal justice system, and towards approaches that really address the public health issues, the real public health issues that surround these substances.
Let me ask a sort of provocative question. Thank you for that answer, Michelle. Let me ask a provocative question that comes to us from Marco Pavicic. You may or may not agree with the premise, but let me throw it out there. He asks, why do you think the drug policy reform movement is often disproportionately represented by white men, when we are often talking, I guess is the caveat to that, about matters that concern communities of colors? Do you agree with that notion, and if so, do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, that's a big question. And, I think that there's a lot of reasons for it. It's something that has definitely concerned me, and continues to concern me. As I mentioned, seeing kind of the imagery associated with, marijuana reform today, is worrisome to me. I think that there's a number of reasons, and I want to address, the fact that I think that within the black community, there has been a lot of mixed feelings about drug policy, because, especially in poorer communities of color, where drug treatment has not been available, where supportive family systems and networks and community networks, are often not readily available. Drug abuse and drug addiction can, absolutely wreak havoc on communities. And, we've seen what happened, as crack moved through our communities. We've seen the harm that drug addiction and drug abuse can cause, and so much of the harm associated with, crack and, heroin and other harmful drugs has to do with the fact that the people who begin using don't have access to treatment, don't have access to support systems, are often, in very, very precarious life circumstances. And so what it means, what drug addiction and drug abuse means in an impoverished, ghettoized community is very different than what it means if you're middle class or upper middle class that have access to rehab and extensive drug treatment or therapy and support. And, so I think as a result, the unique vulnerability of, black communities, especially poor black communities, to the harms associated with drugs has made, has led, many black leaders, black faith leaders, has led many black families to be very fearful of drugs and of legalizing drugs. And so I think that it's a combination of both bias that often exists within, progressive institutions, including drug policy reform, institutions. We like to think of progressive social justice institutions as the good guys, but plenty of bias, unconscious as well as conscious bias and stereotyping, I think, often leads to environments in which people of color do not necessarily feel welcome. And they can be exclusionary environments. But I also think that, within black communities, there has been a lot of ambivalence about, drug policy and, the possibility of legalizing or decriminalizing some drug out of fear that, drugs may be legal and they will still not have drug treatment and they will still not have the kinds of basic supports that are necessary to help people cope. And so, that's why I think it's so critically important that the movement be a movement that's not just about legalizing marijuana, but it's a movement for basic human rights and for the investment in the communities that have been most harmed and for drug treatment and for public health services and the rest. And I think a much more holistic approach to these issues and one that recognizes who really has been most harmed and who's paid the highest price in the drug war is one that will, naturally lead over time to far more, people of color, assuming, very vocal positions and roles of leadership. And I do think drug policy organizations really have to be pushed as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably just right, Michelle. And, somebody said there's a question here that from Ellen Comp in California, and she's thinking about the Latino community, which she reports, and it's true, is actually arrested at higher rates than African Americans in California. And what she sees, and I think you maybe sort of touched on some of this in discussing where and why the black community has sort of stood where it has, is how do we break through the Latino support of drug laws? Have you, having been on the road, interfacing with groups like A New Way Forward or All of Us or None, is there any thoughts about how we begin to work more closely with members of the Latino community to break through some of the stigmas still being embraced?
I think it's absolutely essential, and, in many ways, I have begun to see more clearly in my own work and conversations with people the links between, the movement to end mass incarceration and the movement to end mass deportation and the struggle to end, the extraordinary high levels of violence associated with the drug war and the drug trade in Mexico. And, so I think it's a process of really connecting the dots and showing that, the racially divisive politics that helped to birth the drug war, pitting poor and working class whites against people of color and demonizing people of color in the drug war and all of that helped to birth the Get Tough movement and the war on drugs. Those same kind of politics is what has led to mass deportations and the hostility towards immigrants in the United States. And it is the U.S.-led global drug war that has led to just the horrific, level of violence in Mexico. And at some point we have to say, let's stop the madness. And, for people in Latino communities to recognize that, it is this idea that because of what you have done, some crime, some bad thing that you've done by using a drug or crossing the border, that we can now treat you as less than human, strip you of basic human rights, deport you, or legally discriminate against you in employment and housing and access to education, this devaluing of human beings, because there is some crime that, is as simple as using marijuana or crossing the border, makes you no longer fit for inclusion in mainstream society and, rationalizes or justifies, really just unconscionable treatment to use. This is all based on a common idea, the idea that some of us are undeserving, unworthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. And this idea has been highly racialized in its implementation with respect to African Americans and Latinos, and increasingly, as we've seen in recent years, with immigrants. So I think it's about connecting the dots and also just a lot of public education and consciousness raising in our communities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we only have about 8 minutes or so left, and I have more questions than I'll ever be able to get to. Let me apologize in advance to all the people who've been so very engaged. It's literally hundreds are signed on to the call, and I wish that we could get to everybody, but we just do not have the capacity to do that. But what that tells me is that we have to keep coming back. So in these last few minutes, Michelle, would you talk about, some next steps, some parting words as you go back into reflection mode, as all great thinkers must do? What you would leave us with for the next year or so to consider as we advocate for a society in which every life has value?
I guess all I would say is that I hope we all really dedicate ourselves to the task of movement building and building a truly transformational movement, and not allowing ourselves to settle for rhetoric from politicians, tinkering around the edges of the system, that we really insist that the change that we're seeking is change that will prove truly transformational. And for me, like I said earlier, that means that it's not enough to end the drug war. We have to insist on repairing the harm that has been done. It's not enough for us to decide that marijuana is a not too bad thing when we see white people using it on TV. We have to be willing to view, black women, black men, Latinos who are using marijuana or who want to sell marijuana and starting their own businesses with the same level of care and concern. We cannot settle for kind of politics as usual when it comes to building this movement to end mass incarceration, reimagining our justice system, and trying to repair, to the extent that we can, the harm that has been done. So I hope that we will all commit ourselves to being bold and speaking our truth even when unpopular, and doing what we can in our own communities and within our own networks and spheres of influence to shift consciousness and organize for truly transformational change.
That's Michelle. Thank you so very, very much for joining with us today. Again, we are talking with Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, published by the New Press, and available everywhere. As my daughter said, that book blew up, because everywhere you go, you see it, and we're talking about it, but most importantly, we're advocating on many of the principles contained therein. A recording of this conversation will be made available to you. So for all those who reached out to us to RSVP, we have your email addresses, and we will be ensuring that you know how to access the recording of this conversation. We now have 2 minutes left, Michelle. I thought, some of your answers, I'll just be transparent and perfectly frank. We're longer, so I thought that last one would be longer too, but we actually have 2 minutes. I don't want to cheat anybody out of 2 minutes with you. And so, at the risk of being annoying and coming back a second time for a last look, the other question I might say is that, were there maybe one biggest lesson that you learned from all these years with the advocates? With the people who were saying, these things, all the groups that you mentioned, what was maybe your biggest moment of transformation while you were on the road and meeting people who had lived and survived the real-world consequences of this failed war on drugs?
I would say, that the most important lesson that I've learned is that until people who have been impacted directly, who have either done time or who have family members behind bars or who have been targets of this system, until they are given much, much more room to speak and to be heard, until the public gets to know them as people rather than as statistics or as labels, as felon or as criminals, this system of mass incarceration or the demonizing of the others will continue to hum along in some form for a very, very long time. That the key, I believe now, to truly transformational change is really not only taking their stories seriously and listening to them, but allowing the people who have been most impacted, most harmed, to have real roles of leadership and to help to define what our future ought to look like, in communities that have been hardest hit. For so long it's been the experts talking. It's been academics like me. When you think about crime on the news, you can often hear from police or prosecutors or politicians or the so-called experts or the lawyers. Sometimes you may hear from a victim of some horrific crime who will have the chance to speak and to be heard. But we almost never get to hear from the people who've been locked up and locked out, people whose lives have been, really torn apart. We rarely get to hear from them. We rarely get to meet the people who are struggling to send their kids to school in violence-ridden neighborhoods, who have dreams for themselves and for their children that are much like the dreams that the rest of us have, but they never get heard. And so I think if we're going to really achieve transformational change, we're going to have to get to know the people that we've demonized, allow them to have a voice, listen to them, and even allow ourselves to be led by them.
Well, that is a really stunning note to end on, a note after my own heart, that we actually hear, as Mumia Abu-Jamal would say, from the voice of the voiceless, and those who have not gone heralded or heard in this movement that really has started to elevate those who have been unheard and unelevated and excoriated. Michelle Alexander, I know I speak for everybody at Drug Policy Alliance and for the hundreds of advocates around the nation who have taken a moment out of their schedules to join us on this call to continue the conversation, in thanking you and saying that, you know, in this fight for compassion and for justice, you are standing tall, a mighty tree, and you are appreciated by all of us. Thank you, Michelle Alexander.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you and all of the work the DPA and your allies have been doing for so long.
All right, my friends, we've come to the end of this call. Please do expect to hear from us about how you can get a recording of this call and when we will continue this quarterly webinar series on matters that concern those of us who are battling the failed war on drugs. My name is Asha Vandelli. I'm proud to represent Drug Policy Alliance's movement building team. Have a good afternoon.